Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. And everybody's been here and has heard my rap on this, so I won't go through it again. But as you know, many of us feel we're one of the premier institutes for Marxism, not only on the West Coast, but globally. And we have people from diverse views, so we don't represent any single sectarian viewpoint. Okay, so we're very fortunate today in having our good friend Al Sargis, who knows everything there is to know about war. So he chuckles, but he's remarkably well informed. So I think most people know Al because that's why you're here. So I'll just turn it over to you. What we'll do is Al will speak for roughly 45 minutes, an hour.
An hour and 15 minutes.
An hour and 15 minutes. Then we'll take a break and relieve you of any money you might have, and then proceed with Q&A. And we'll also make an announcement of our upcoming events. We do have some. Yeah. So, all yours, Al.
Thank you. Good morning. So here we are, women in war. This is a condensed, highly condensed and revised version of a talk that I gave in March 2011. The original one lasted more than 2 hours. But this one obviously will be somewhat less. I might add that I'm going to eliminate certain parts of that original talk. Specifically, I'm going to eliminate a discussion of feminist and other theories of women in war. I'm going to eliminate the discussion of conventional armies after World War I and the U.S. military after the Civil War. I might just add, in relationship to the United States, the question of women in combat was something that was discussed beginning in the 1990s when women served in combat zones up through the present. And women in the military, plus women veterans, pushed for women to get into the combat arms. They were opposed mainly by men, both in and out of the military. But that battle was won around 2015 when the official policy, the policy was officially announced that women could be put in all areas of the military. And they were particularly talking about the Army, because in the Air Force and the Navy, women were like on battleships or in fighter jets and so on and so forth. But in the Army and in the Marines, they were not in the infantry, artillery, et cetera, et cetera. But that policy in 1950 was changed to permit them to do so. And so I say that battle is over. What currently exists are the skirmishes. That is, the attempts to apply that policy in certain areas, of which I might add the Marines, being the most socially conservative, are the most resistant. Okay, even this year was the first year that women and men served together in boot camp, whereas all the other branches of services, they served together in basic training. Up until this year, women and men served separately, okay, in basic training. Anyhow, I'm also going to drastically reduce the discussion on women in the national liberation movement and socialist armies, because I've already made previous separate talks on fighting women in Cuba, Vietnam, China, and the USSR. Okay? I touch on them lightly, and if I have time, I'll go into detail at the very end, but I don't know if I'll have the time to do that. Maybe one day when I'm videoed, I'll do the previous discussions on those topics. Okay, so what will I discuss? I'm going to discuss women fighters or combatants and women who are direct support troops of those combatants. That is, women who serve right behind the front lines. Okay? The approach I'm going to use is historical and comparative. I'm going to look at different kinds of societies as much as what flows out of the Marxist view. That is, look at clan and tribal, ancient slave, feudal, capitalist, and socialist. Okay? I'll cover all those. So that's the historical element. I'm also going to look at them comparatively, that is, by geographic areas, different countries, different regions, and so forth. So I'm going to go back basically about 10,000 years. And I'm also going to look at women's roles in the military activities, both as individuals and in male units and in all-female units. In short, I'm going to historically and by types of society look at women's roles in as combatants or direct supporters of combatants. Now, just a word about writing about women. In my estimate, based upon some other estimates as well as my own, based upon reading about, I'd say about 35 books on the topic, I've come to the conclusion that over the last 10,000 years, if you add women together, they estimate between 15 and 20 million women or fighters. That's compared to hundreds of millions of men. Right? Up to the 1970s, I would say, in terms of the writing on women in war, 95% were on women who did not fight, women who tended to be in more passive roles, women who were viewed as victims of war, survivors of war, or supporters of men who were fighting wars, or as peacemakers. 5% maybe dealt with women who were actually directly involved in some kind of combat role in war. This, I might add, began to change in the 1970s. And what happened in the 1970s? Women's studies. Prior to that time, I'd say 98% of what I read was written by men. It was kind of like history. And then after the 1970s, it became herstory. And that is, with the beginning of women's studies, you begin to find more and more women writing about this very masculinized subject. If I was going to make an analogy, I'd say prior to the 1970s, women writing were like raindrops. In the 1970s, it was more like the amount of women writing were like creeks, the size of creeks, okay? By the 1980s, it was like rivers. By the 1990s, it was like small lakes. I don't mean Lake Merritt. I mean like the Great Lakes. And today, the amount of writing on the subject of women in war, women are like oceans. Instead of being like about 3 or 4% prior to 1970, on this particular topic, you find women are like 85% of the writers on this topic. Most of this stuff is still done on women in non-combatant roles. I'd say 75% is on women in non-combatant roles, but the 25%, okay, has expanded from about 2% prior. Okay. What I want to impress on you is kind of like a quantitative hit, or what I call a shotgun approach. Okay? I want to overwhelm you with this idea of women as combatants. Okay? Because while I'll speak of several dozen instances, that's several dozen out of tens of thousands of instances. Okay, so let me begin. First, let me deal with some examples of all-female units. Now, I'll start with the Dahomey, or Dahomey. I never could figure that one out. That's a West African kingdom in the present country of Benin. And from the 16th to the 19th century, the Dahomey, which was a slave-based society, conquered and enslaved many nearby tribes. And then eventually, when the Europeans, basically the British and the French, came in, they fought the Europeans. The kingdom ended when they were conquered by France in 1872. Now, what was significant about Dahomey is that they had a woman army. There were men, about 12,000 men, okay, but there were also 5,000 women fighters. And the women fighters were inaugurated in around 1727, when men suffered so many casualties they didn't want to fight. And so that's when the women came forward, okay, and the women, you might say, took over. They were, after that period, in the 1727, women were the main frontline fighters. That is, they were considered the fiercest. They would go in first, and then the males' army would kind of come behind them. The women fought with swords, muskets, 17th, circa 1700 cannons, bows and arrows, daggers, battle axes, and they even had a women's elephant cavalry. Now,
that's pretty good.
I had that the men who did not want to serve hired a woman to replace them. Okay? Also, the men dressed in women's clothes because they thought that they would become as fierce as the women if they wore the same clothes as the women. Okay. And now the women's army ended when they were finally defeated by the French, and they were when the French took over. Okay, for their colonial army, they only hired men, and that was kind of like the end of the women's army. But that was an example of an all-female fighting force. I'll give you another quick example. Russia in World War I, the so-called death battalions. Now, there was a peasant woman, Maria Bakiyev, which I mispronounced, but that's close enough, who was a monarchist and who went in the Tsarist army in World War I, first disguised as a man. Okay. Later, she came out of her disguise and she appealed to the Tsar to let her stay in the army. And the Tsar said, okay. And there were other women who appealed to the Tsar and who fought. But what about this particular woman was important was that after the February Revolution in 1917, she appealed to Kerensky. And she said, the men don't want to fight, but if we have an all-women's unit, that'll shame the men into fighting. Okay? Well, she formed one of four regiments. Okay, and there were 6,000 in total in all the regiments, but in her regiment of 2,000 was the most important because they did most of the fighting. They weren't very successful, I might add, because if you remember at the time, the men did not want to fight, right? This was between February and the October Revolution. So a lot of the men, probably most, did not want to fight the Germans. In fact, by that time, they were fraternizing with the Germans, soldiers. Okay? So when Maria's troops got to the front line, in order to attack the German line, right, all the women jumped up, right, and started to charge. Only a handful of men joined them. The majority of men stayed in the trenches, right? They did not even provide covering fire. Okay? So the women were pretty much slaughtered. 25% of them were killed. When they retreated back to the trenches, they found that the trenches were empty and the men had gone to the second level of trenches. Okay? And had also not covered them, right, when they were in retreat. Right? So it did very little to shame the men, and they fought in a few other battles, and the same thing happened. So the death battalions, as I say, were never successful. But it was an example of an all-women fighting unit. In both Dahomey and the 1917 Russia, women described themselves as, quote, no longer women but men, or, quote, no longer women but soldiers, which reflected their traditional roles in each society. Another example, in the 19th century Taiping rebellion in China, the rebels formed many all-female fighting units. And I say many, I mean there were maybe about 50, 100,000 women all told during that rebellion that fought in all-female units. And of course, for those who know anything about it, know that this civil war was probably the most deadly civil war in history. where tens of millions of people were killed. In the 2nd century AD in China, on the frontier, there were also units, all-women units, that were the frontier guards, and that when attacks occurred across the frontier, they're the first ones to meet the attackers. In the 11th to 13th century, China female shock troops were used in many northwest China battles. Now, if you ever see these movies on China, what was that one about the dragon?
Crouching Tiger.
Yeah, Crouching Tiger. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there was a woman in there, right? And she's jumping around doing all these martial arts, and you know, you might think it would just quote PC to put a woman in there. No. Women then, as well as the women in the People's Liberation Army today, are also trained in martial arts. And they did those things. Okay? Except that they usually did them not among men, but they did them fighting men in all-women units. All-women army units also fought in the Danish army against the Spaniards in the 16th century. Montenegrin women's battalion fought the Turks, 1858. In the Crimean War, there was a all-women Kurdish cavalry battalion. Okay? Some people look today and they say, look at the Syrian Kurdish women, right? In the fighting, right? And they say, look, wow. But not the first time. Not the first time that there's a tradition, a history that goes back, okay, at least a century, all right, where women were doing the same thing in a different war. Another example, in the 1600s in the Congo, the Monopotapa kingdom had standing armies of women. In Malawi, in 1964, 5,000 women were used as border guards. And today, there is a tank battalion composed of Malawi women, okay, in Somalia, who are part of the UN troops in Somalia. Okay, let me speak now about some mixed gender units. Historically, while all-female Army combat units are relatively rare, mixed gender units are more common. More often, they started as women in combat support roles, but when these units were in combat, women also participated. I'll give you an example of from support to combat. Camp followers. Camp followers, right? The popular version of camp followers where they were prostitutes, right? And camp followers existed in all major, quite a few minor armies, going back from the ancient slave societies all the way through the late 19th century, including the Civil War in the United States, that were camp followers. And in all continents that I've been able to find material about camp followers, they existed in all continents. Who are camp followers, if not prostitutes? Well, there were prostitutes, but the majority of women were wives And then the majority of others that were not the wives or girlfriends were children. Okay? They would follow the troops, camp followers, right? They would follow their husbands, boyfriends. Some of the women were runaways because they wanted to get away from stifling peasant villages. Okay? And what was their role? They were the direct supporters of the male fighters. They were what we call today support troops. What did they do, for example? They went out and found and cooked food. They were the tailors. They were the medics. They were the persons who gathered and distributed supplies to the troops. They cleaned and repaired weapons. And occasionally, they would go and fight with their husbands or boyfriends. Okay, there's this thing about Molly Pitcher. I don't know if you remember her in the Revolutionary War, right? Her husband was an artilleryman, and she was among the camp followers of the revolutionary U.S. revolutionary forces. Husband was killed. She went up and took over his position on the artillery piece. Okay? And that was typical. Okay? And I say camp followers probably account for, I would say, more than 1 million women if you go back the last 5,000 years.
Molly pictures with water bearers.
Another area which you have mixed, you find a lot of mixed gender forces are in guerrilla armies. Very common to find them in guerrilla or partisan armies, serving in a variety of crucial roles. In the Cold War and post-Cold War eras, women were found in guerrilla armies in Vietnam, South Africa, Argentina, Cyprus, Iran, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Palestine, Nicaragua, and many other countries. Okay. They were involved in street fighting, assassinations, intelligence gathering, and propaganda work. For example, in Italy during World War II, 35,000 women were partisans and 650 were killed in combat situations. In Yugoslavia, 12% of the National Liberation Army were women. Most did medical work, but they often had to fight because of the situations that they were in. However, of the 100,000 women in the Yugoslav army, 42% were designated as fighters, and they were killed at more than twice the rate as men. That is about 25% of the women were killed compared to 11% of the men. I've read several books on Yugoslavian women in the war because a lot has been written about them. And I always get a visceral reaction when I read or when I hear some stuff about, well, women can't fight. I always remember where the women were, that is, women in the Yugoslav partisan army, during wintertime, they had to climb high mountains, through mountain passes, okay, in knee-deep snow, carrying 50-pound packs plus their weapons, right? And then they swooped down on Germans who were in the valleys, okay? And I thought of all the the trials and tribulations that these women had to go through, right? And it gets me physically really pissed off when I hear guys say, well, women can't fight, they can't carry the loads, it's too much for them, and whatever their excuse is as to why women should not be allowed into fighting units. Right? In Vietnam, 60,000 women were in the People's Army of Vietnam, that's the North Vietnam Army, and over 1 million women were in militias and local and guerrilla groups in the North. 40% of regimental commanders were women. There was a woman who was a general at that time. They served in all women as well as mixed gender units. There was trouble, as oftentimes occurs, with male chauvinism in mixed units. And as the war dragged on, women were put more and more into single gender units, as into all women units. In the North, women were mobilized into the Army around 1967 and were mainly in medical liaison, bomb diffusing, and anti-aircraft and coast artillery units. That is, when you see American planes being shot down, they're being shot down by women who are manning anti-aircraft guns or anti-aircraft missiles. When you see ships, mostly American ships, being incapacitated or sunk off the coast, those were women that were manning the, or womaning, however you look at it, the coastal artillery pieces. Okay? They also served in the, I'm speaking about the North now, they also served in village militias. Most all women, whether they were in the militia or not, were armed. In the South, they did support work, although more were assigned to combat units than in the North. Perhaps the largest single contingent of Vietnamese Army women served on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where they served both in anti-aircraft artillery, as communications or in supply. They were involved in the South in several major battles. During the Tet Offensive in Saigon, the head of the NLF Army, or I believe they called it the People's Liberation Armed Forces, was a woman general. Okay, she was in charge of the attack on Saigon during the Tet Offensive. Women were also extensively involved in defending the, in the attack on Hue during the Tet Offensive. Okay, well, they were eventually repelled from Hue by the Americans and the South Vietnamese Army. Okay? But what is not often mentioned is that there was a battalion of South Vietnamese women who were part of the South Vietnamese Army. The South Vietnamese, or I call it the Saigon Army, also had all-women units, okay, that were heavily involved in fighting in the Mekong Delta. So we had women on both sides. As in many of these cases, I'd say most of these cases, while women's combat participation was upheld as a model to be emulated, after the war it was downplayed and the image of women as mothers replaced the image of women as fighters. In Vietnam, during the wartime, of course you saw the image of the woman with a rifle in one hand and a baby in the other, right? Very popular image. You never saw, of course, a man with a rifle and a baby, right? But after the war, the image changed.